The dynamic multiplication table project is a great example of using nested repetitions to build values for rows in a text box, and the values are the intersections of the column and row headings in this table. It's a great example of doing that, and I use various versions of this in almost every beginning programming class that I teach. But I thought here in this course, using Visual Basic, I would do things a little bit differently, and that is to gather the input from the user on where they want the rows and the columns to start as far as that beginning value, and I would do that using TrackBars, or what we might refer to as scroll bars in other platforms. I can choose a value for the column to start, and notice that as I move this thumbnail, the values are changing across the top column headings to reflect the first value that I choose and then the next 9 values after that. The same with the row. We can change the row headings. I'll choose 50, and so I'm getting 50 through 59 for the row headings, and then each intersection is the value of the row and the column. So for example here, 50 times 30 is 1500, 51 times 30 is 1530, and so forth. The 3 labels have their fonts set to Courier News, their model space, so everything lines up nicely. That's one of the keys to this. And then I have 2 labels to simply display what the value is of each of the track bars. And that's the value that's used then in the calculations. Let's take a look at the project instructions. I mentioned here in the instructions on alignment that for next loops are really ideal for this type of project. However, since we used nested for next loops on the previous project with the 12 days of Christmas, I'm going to suggest you try to do this one instead using do loops. In fact, there are 4 loops that are required. One has nested loops and 2 other loops, one for the heading and one for the row numbers, that I used the 4 different do loops: a do while, a do until, and a do loop while, and a do loop until. And that would give you experience in all 4 of those. Again, we can often interchange the for next and the do loops, and this is a great example of being able to do that. As you've already seen, our project is to create a dynamic multiplication table where the user chooses values from 2 track bars for the column headings and the row headings, and then have it build the table. And again, remember to use a monospaced font such as Courier News so that everything lines up. And I use pad left to create my columns. Here's the storyboard. So I used 3 labels for my output, one for the columns, one for the headers, one for the table itself, my 2 track bars, and then 2 additional labels that show the value of the track bars. All the coding is in response to the changes of the values, the value changed property for those track bars. And you can use this illustration to test and make sure your multiplication table generates the correct values. Here's a bit larger version of the storyboard. Try creating this project on your own, but what will follow is my code review if you need some help. I used a form load event handler handling myBase.load just to ensure that the 2 values start at 1 to begin with. Obviously, we can set that up in our properties within the GUI development, but this is a way you could make sure that those start at 1 when the project begins. The code then for the build table, which is handling the value changed event for both of my track bars, I'm going to get the values from those 2 track bars and set the 2 labels for LBL column start and LBL row start to the value of those track bars. I'm going to dim call start as an integer and dim row start as an integer, and those are going to equal those same values. LBL column.header.text, I'm going to clear it. I'm going to clear the header row, and I'm going to clear the table itself, LBL table. I'm going to dim R and C as integers. Those are going to be my counters for my 2 loops to create the row and column headers. So C equals column start, whatever value the user chose from that track bar. And then do while C is less than call start plus 10. So it's going to go from that value that they chose to and the next 9 values. It's less than, so it won't include the column start plus 10, but will include the column start plus 9. The LBL column header dot text then, I'm going to concatenate the value of C to a string. I'm going to pad that to the left in a field of 8 characters with periods for the additional characters. And then I'm going to increment C. So that loop will run 10 times. Then I do the similar thing for R equaling row start. Here though I use a do until. Again, you could use a do while, you could use a for loop, you could use a do loop until or a do loop while. In this case, these are all really interchangeable. So do until R is greater than row start plus 9. So it's going to go through 10 times. And LBL row header dot text, I'm going to concatenate R.toString, and then a carriage return line feed, because I want this then to enter down to the next line. That will give me my 10 lines of the row headers in LBL row header label. Now I want to create the table itself. And to create the table, we're going to use nested loops. I'm going to start with R being reset to row start, and then my do loop, a do loop while. I have within that C equals call start, and then a nested loop of do LBL table.text, and I'm going to concatenate C times R, convert that to a string, pad that to the left in a field of 8 characters with periods for those blank characters, and increment C. That's going to give me my row going across. Then I added a little conditional here to also concatenate a carriage return line feed if the row is not the last row. So if row does not equal row start plus 9, I'm going to add a carriage return line feed. I then need to increment my row value in the outer do loop while. So we're going to get our 10 rows. That's the procedure to create that table and the power of using nested do loops in doing so. Let me also show you how you could do this with for loops. So I created a for loop version and I commented that out. But you can see here, it's basically the same at the beginning, and then I used a for next to create my column headers and another for next to create the row headers. And then the table is a nested for next inside another for next. So my for next with the rows and my inner for next for the column values, and then generating the intersection of the column and row, concatenating that onto LBL table.text. And again, I want to add a carriage return line feed if it's not the last line of my table. Two different ways of doing this, and of course, you can see how we can interchange the for next and the do loops. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.